So now we're back to our diagram, and I've highlighted the flashing box, the mitochondria. Let's zoom on in for a closer look. Here we have the mitochondria. Artist drawing on top, actual picture on the bottom. And so the job of the mitochondria, in middle school they give cute little nicknames to cell parts. In middle school you may have been told this is the powerhouse, but you may never have been told why. Well, it's the powerhouse because its job is to make an energy molecule by the name of adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So the mitochondria does a very important process known as cellular respiration. And during the process of cellular respiration, it will create an energy molecule by the name of ATP. ATP is a molecule used by your cells for energy. So the analogy is the mitochondria is kind of like the battery of your cells. What's interesting about the mitochondria is we're pretty certain the mitochondria used to be a living organism. It used to be basically a bacteria cell, but it has become part of today's modern cells. And this theory of how we think this happened is called endosymbiosis. I'll go over in more detail in just a moment. Well, when we look at some of the evidence for why we think the mitochondria used to be its own living organism is because it has its own DNA. It has its own ribosomes. Because it has its own ribosomes, it can manufacture its own proteins. And the mitochondria does something very important to life. The mitochondria can reproduce and replicate. So when you look at this evidence, we're pretty certain the mitochondria used to be a free living organism, a bacteria species, but it's become part of cells. Well, how did that happen? That's what endosymbiosis tries to explain. I hope I can visualize that on the next slide. Okay, so I really want to try to visualize the endosymbiosis theory. Here we have a large predator cell in orange that's going to devour that red mitochondria ancestor. Watch this. So there it goes. It just devoured the mitochondria ancestor. But the way we think it happened is that red mitochondria survived and divided and multiplied. It's just trapped inside of the large predator cell. Well, as the two go about their lives, the large predator cell eventually is going to multiply and divide as well. And watch this. When cells divide, they often grow, and then they split right down the middle, and now you have two cells with the mitochondria ancestors trapped inside of them. And then the process simply continues. So the mitochondria ancestors keep multiplying, and then the orange predator cell divides in half. And over time, over millions and millions of years, the two have become so dependent on one another that they can't survive without them. So this is kind of what the endosymbiosis theory it tries to explain, is how cells became more complex. How did we obtain certain cell parts? And this is the explanation for how we think the mitochondria was obtained. Okay, let's zoom on in. Let's focus on the lysosomes back in our diagram here. Let's zoom on in for a closer look at the lysosomes. And so the lysosomes contain inside of them very powerful digestive enzymes, and that's what my little animated scissors here are showing. So the blue circle is the lysosome with the animated scissors representing the enzymes inside. And so lysosomes have various jobs. Number one is to break down food. So here we have a protein molecule that's being taken into the cell, and the protein is being broken down into smaller parts. I hope you know those smaller parts are called amino acids. Here we have an example of a white blood cell. You probably know white blood cells' job is to fight off infections like bacteria and viruses. Well, that's what we call pathogens. Things that cause disease are called pathogens. And so here's a virus or a bacteria, and notice how it just landed on a white blood cell. Well, what happens is the white blood cell will swallow up that pathogen, put it inside of a lysosome, and those powerful digestive enzymes will destroy it. So that's one way that our immune system keeps us healthy. And then there's the process called autolysis, where it's basically an aging cell will destroy itself. And so in the middle of our picture here, we have a group of cells, and I have the animated scissors, because what happens is when cells are dying and aging, they will kind of self-destruct in a process called autolysis, where the lysosomes will release all the digestive enzymes and kill that cell. It leaves behind a gap, but don't worry, that gap will simply be filled in as cells multiply. So you've heard the expression, out with the old, in with the new. A couple other cell parts I want to mention are used in movement, and that's the job of cilia and flagella. Now, not all cells move, so not all cells have cilia and flagella, but if cells move, they probably have either cilia or flagella. So the picture on the left shows the cilia, short hair-like extensions. There's numerous, hundreds and thousands of them per cell. Way too many to count. Very short, stubby, almost look like eyelashes. They're so short and stubby. The picture on the right shows a sperm cell with a real long flagella. Flagella is actually the plural version. Flagellum is singular. And so the difference is really their length. The cilia, short, stubby. Flagella are long and whip-like, and usually there's only a few of them. Maybe only one flagellum, maybe two, maybe three, maybe four, but not nearly as many as the cilia. Well, in that picture on the right, we have a sperm cell about to penetrate a female egg cell to create a fertilized egg, also known as a zygote. Let's have a little fun with this. So, after the sperm fertilizes the egg, that fertilized egg is going to grow into a fetus. Here we have a nice little ultrasound showing a child growing inside of a pregnant woman. Well, eventually, 9 months later, that child's going to be born. Well, let's follow the life of this child. 17 years go by. 17 years later, hey, it's your first day at high school, and so here you go, welcome to high school. And hopefully 4 years after that, you'll be celebrating your graduation from high school. So this all started because of that flagella that provided the swimming movement to fertilize an egg. So we look at the next part I want to mention is the cell wall. And so this is the outermost layer of plants, fungus, and bacteria cells. So from left to right, we have plants, fungi, and bacteria. Notice animals, like humans, do not have a cell wall. Well, we also mentioned that the cell wall is the outermost layer. So when we look at this picture, we have a yellow layer and a green layer. So I hope you know that yellow layer represents the plasma membrane, or the cell membrane. And in the definition, we see that the outermost layer is the cell wall. So that's represented by the green layer. Well, what about its job? One of the jobs of the cell wall is to add support. It's made from a real tough, sturdy material known as cellulose. And so this adds some of the support to plants and fungus and bacteria cells that have. And so, as I just mentioned, the cell wall is made from a real tough material by the name of cellulose. It's very hard to digest. The reason for the picture is celery has a lot of cellulose in it. And I'm sure you've had bites of celery. It's a very tough, very fibrous plant, very hard to digest. Well, that's because you're having to chew through a lot of cellulose, which is a main ingredient of the cell wall. And the cell wall really started our understanding of cells. Earlier in another video, we learned that Robert Hooke in 1665, again, there's no real good pictures of Robert Hooke, so here we just have a stained glass picture in a cathedral. Robert Hooke in 1665 examined cork. And so he used a very primitive microscope, like this one in this picture here, and as I mentioned a moment ago, he examined cork. Now cork, we might be familiar with cork from, wine bottles, but cork is actually tree bark. And he examined a real thin slice of tree bark called cork, and this is what he saw. In this picture here is a drawing that he made. It's kind of shocking to believe that this picture right here is a drawing made by hand, but that's how good of an artist he was. And what you see are hundreds of little tiny cells, but the outline of the cell is all that's left. He did a drawing of the cell wall. There was no nucleus. Cork and tree bark is dead. There was no nucleus when he made the drawing. There were no mitochondria, no vacuoles. All that's left and all you can see in the picture is the drawing of the cell wall. The cell wall is very tough, very strong, and can last for years and years after the cells have died. So the next part I want to mention is called the chloroplasts. And so you might know the job of the chloroplast is to perform photosynthesis. Well, here are several dozen plant cells taken with a microscope. Let's zoom on in for a closer look. When we zoom on in, we can see that inside of every cell are dozens of those green round-shaped objects called chloroplasts. They're inside every single cell, and there's dozens of them per cell. So you know that the job of the chloroplast is to perform photosynthesis. Well, inside of the chloroplast is a chemical, a green chemical by the name of chlorophyll. The job of chlorophyll is to actually perform photosynthesis. It will absorb sunlight, absorb carbon dioxide, absorb water, and turn those into oxygen and sugar, particularly in the form of glucose. So what photosynthesis does is it uses three ingredients: water, carbon dioxide, sunlight, and will release two products, oxygen and sugar called glucose. Just like the mitochondria, the chloroplast is thought to have evolved and become a cell part according to the endosymbiosis theory. We think the chloroplast was also a free-living organism, a bacteria. In our animation, here we have a predator cell devouring the chloroplast, but not really being digested. That chloroplast ancestor in green multiplies, just like we saw a moment ago with the mitochondria ancestors. And notice how the two are just living together. The green chloroplast ancestors are just trapped inside of the larger one. Well, as time goes by, the larger cell divides and splits into two. And as years go by, these two have become so dependent on one another that they are now a part of each other. And the evidence to support this is, again, the chloroplasts, just like the mitochondria, have their own DNA and ribosomes. They make their own proteins. They can replicate and multiply and divide. These are all real strong indicators that the chloroplasts were probably once a free-living organism all by itself, but has become taken into the cell and become part of modern cells. So the final one, the last part I want to mention, is called the vacuole. The job of the vacuole is to store food, store water, waste, color pigments. And in the picture here, you can see it's the big blue round object in the middle of the cell. Often, in plants that is, it's often the largest part of a plant cell. So in plants, it's often the largest central, meaning in the middle. So we often think of the nucleus being in the middle of a cell. Well, often the vacuole is, because it's so big, it pushes all the other parts to the edges. When we look at this little animation right here, again, I mentioned cytoplasmic streaming earlier here. The green circles represent chloroplasts, but they're all kind of revolving around the central vacuole. And so the central vacuole is often so big, it will push the other organelles to the edge of the cell. So in plants, there tends to be a large central vacuole, but it's not like that with animal cells. Here's a diagram, a drawing of an animal cell, and the vacuoles are much smaller, and they're usually randomly scattered throughout the cytoplasm, but they still serve the same purpose. They still store food, store water, store waste, and so that's really the job of the vacuole right there.